Thank you so much for coming out. So this land where we are gathered this afternoon is now a shared land, and its history is a shared history. And if we're to fully understand that history, we must listen carefully to one another across our differences. We must be curious about, rather than dismissive of, things that we don't know or understand. And could I ask for these lights to be turned out? Thank you very much. We might have to learn to empathize with people against whom our hearts might be hardened because of old wounds and traumas. This is fundamentally why I have come here, to affirm a common humanity and to express my profound hope for the healing of all the peoples. We are united, if nothing more, by our affection for this land that sustains us. Back on August 18th, 1862, a faction of the Dakota people, desperate for food and freedom, rose up against white settlers, traders, and troops in southwestern Minnesota. The uprising began on the Sioux or Dakota reservation, and it quickly spread. It only lasted 6 weeks, but it was a pivotal event in the history of this continent. It resulted, first of all, in more white American casualties and refugees than any other Indian war. At least 650 white Minnesotans were killed, most of them unarmed civilians. More than a fifth of the state's white population was displaced, and many of those people would never return to their homes. The Dakota side also suffered. An estimated 100 warriors fell in battle, and after the fighting, U.S. military tribunals condemned another 303 Dakota men to death for their alleged participation in the fighting. 38 of those men were eventually hanged in Mankato, Minnesota, on the day after Christmas, 1862. This was at the order of President Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln later commuted the death sentences of the remaining condemned men to prison terms, but at least a third of those men would die while in confinement. The hanging of the 38 in Mankato remains the largest judicial mass execution in American history. Meanwhile, military forces under Brigadier General Henry Sibley rounded up 1,600 to 1,800 Dakota people who hadn't already fled Minnesota after the final battle of the war, and he interned them for half a year in a stockade below Fort Snelling near St. Paul. Most of the detainees were children, women, and elders. Hundreds of them perished in that camp from malnutrition, disease, and murder at the hands of whites. The following May, in 1863, the surviving 1,200 or so Dakotas were forcibly expelled from the state of Minnesota. They were shipped to a new reservation in Dakota Territory that we now call Crow Creek. Hundreds more Dakotas died en route and shortly after deportation. This conflict ignited decades of fighting between the U.S. Army and the Ocheti-Sakowin. And that period of military engagement effectively ended on December 29th, 1890, with the massacre at Wounded Knee. By that point, American subjugation of the West was almost complete, and the Dakota people, part of the Ocheti-Sakowin, had been reduced to a diaspora nation. Today, because of the war, there are Dakota communities in 5 states and 2 Canadian provinces. Decades after these events, their painful repercussions are still with us, yet a remarkable number of people remain unaware that they ever happened. I used to be one of those people. Back in South Dakota, I twice attended screenings of a documentary called Dakota 38. If you haven't seen it, you can watch it for free online. Just Google Dakota 38 film and you'll be able to see that. I first attended a screening with a predominantly Euro-American audience, and then I watched with an almost entirely Dakota audience. And as I viewed the film and I participated in the discussions afterwards, it really struck me that many of the factors that led to the uprising in 1862 are still with us even today, especially in South Dakota. These are just some of those factors. So I was really shaken by this film and by what I was hearing afterwards, as well as some of my own experiences in South Dakota since moving there. And I felt like I needed to respond as a writer to what I was learning. I also felt I needed to do that in fiction. Now, why fiction? It's a good question. I was asking that myself because in my long career as an author, I had never written a novel. The idea of tackling a totally new genre intimidated me. And this would be a research-intensive historical novel involving cultures completely foreign to my own, as well as the brutal complexities of war. I seriously doubted I could pull it off, but I had to try. I had to try because I believe in the power of stories. Stories can be good medicine for what ails us, can't they? I mean, that's one reason that we bother to tell them. Stories can help us delve beneath jockeying facts and opinions to get to the heart of the matter so that we can better understand ourselves and one another. Stories can help us recover from woundedness and trauma. They can nudge us toward the difficult reparation of wrongs. They can help us prevent additional injury. So yes, for these and all kinds of other reasons, I needed to tell a story. It was just a matter of finding the right one. Well, finding the right story and getting it researched and written took me 6 years. This is Beneath the Same Stars. It is based on the life of Sarah Wakefield. How many have heard of her? Wow, okay. So then you know I can go home now. Right. She was a white doctor's wife living on the Upper Sioux Agency, and she got caught up in the fighting. And what I would like to do now is share with you just a few stories behind the story that you'll read in this book's pages. You ready? Okay. Story number 1. On a brisk November day, I'm traipsing through a dense woods off the 10-rod road in North Kingstown, Rhode Island. The Brown family cemetery is supposed to be somewhere in this thicket. Dead leaves crunch under my feet. Dead briars clutch at my coat and my pants. I keep tripping over half-buried rocks and hidden tree roots, and as the sun begins to slide behind some ominous gray clouds, I'm tempted to give up. And then, off in the woods to my right, I spot a stone fence. The thrill of discovery spills down my spine and stops me dead in my tracks because after all of my looking through digital archives and dusty old books, history is right here in front of me. Very real and very human. This fence stands about waist high, and as I slowly advance on it, I can see on the other side maybe a dozen slate and limestone grave markers jutting out of the face of the hill. Most of the walls are in disrepair. I could easily step through one of the gaps to enter the cemetery, but instead I circle the perimeter until I come to a tumble-down gate with a missing door. I step through. Whose hands laid this fence? How long ago? Do the walls date all the way back to the earliest graves dug in the 1820s, if not before. I mean, time has so eroded the oldest grave markers that I can't make out the years. I've come to Rhode Island to research the life of Sarah Brown Butts Wakefield, a rather infamous captive during the U.S.-Dakota War. How do you like that hairdo? Yeah. Sarah was born on a farm near this cemetery in 1829. In these graves rest her kin. I go through the cemetery looking for familiar names, and at the highest point on the hill I find William, the father she adored, his inscription all but erased by time. He died when she was only 7 years old. The mother from whom Sarah was estranged as an adult does not lie beside him. She's buried elsewhere beside her second husband, Pitt Vaughn. I'm standing here on sacred ground. I can't walk anywhere without stepping either on a grave or fragments of gravestones. I feel a responsibility to these dead to tell their kinswoman's story as best I can and to wrestle some good from it. I stoop down and pick up a chunk of limestone, once the corner of a gravestone. It might be grave robbing, but I'm going to take this home with me to South Dakota. I'm going to hold on to it until I finish my work. Someday, I'll bring it back and lay it to rest. Right. So yes, it's a peaceful June day on the Upper Sioux Agency near Granite Falls, Minnesota. I seem to be alone on this historic site. And as I go around, I try to imagine how the place looked in 1862, the trading post, the agency village up here on the bluff where reservation staff and their families lived and labored. Down below, the steamboat landing somewhere near the junction of the Yellow Medicine and Minnesota rivers. Further out, the teepees and farmhouses of Dakota people, reservations, pastures and fields, and still further out, 2 Presbyterian mission stations, one of them in the charge of an old doctor named Thomas Williamson, and the other belonging to the Reverend Stephen Riggs. I try to imagine all this, but I can't quite bring it into focus. I circle a mound of rubble overgrown with grass and dandelions. This is all that remains of the 2-story brick warehouse that was once the most imposing building on the bluff. It was the base of all upper agency operations, and apparently it had dwarfed its counterpart on the lower Sioux Agency at the opposite end of the reservation. Here on the warehouse grounds, the U.S. government would annually distribute to the Upper Sioux tribes, the Sissetuan and the Wahpetuan, the money, food, and supplies that it was obligated by treaty to provide. At least it was supposed to make such distributions. If it had done so in full and on time in 1861 and 1862, who knows, perhaps there would never have been a war. Now, Thomas Galbraith, the agent who was in charge of the entire Sioux reservation, had one of his offices inside this warehouse, and so too, do I believe, did the physician. Now, by physician, I'm referring to John Wakefield, Sarah Wakefield's husband. I don't have a picture of him. None seems to exist, but this is his brother, James Beach, and who knows, maybe this gives us some idea what John looked like. John Wakefield was not a very nice fellow, and that's all I'm going to say about him. Now, across the green from the rubble pile stands the only building with any historic relevance, really, on the site anymore. This is a recently reconstructed brick duplex in which I believe that Sarah and John lived with their 2 young children, James and Nellie. Again, I can't be sure, the record is unclear, but I see the Wakefields occupying one side of a duplex like this, with perhaps the Thomas Galbraith family living on the other side of the center wall. Now, how did Sarah, who was born in Rhode Island on a farm only a stone's throw from the Atlantic Ocean, how did she end up living here in a sea of prairie grass, half a continent away, on an Indian reservation? Mentally, I trace the shadowy outlines of her life. How her father died when she was so very young. How soon after that, Pitt Vaughn became stepfather to her and her brothers. How in her teens, perhaps to escape unhappiness at home, nobody knows, she apparently set off alone for the big city of Providence, Rhode Island. How she eventually took up there with a silversmith named Butts. Great name, isn't it? How she gave birth to a daughter named Florence. How she soon abandoned Florence and her father and disappeared from the public record, only to reappear a few short years later getting married to John Wakefield in Shakopee, Minnesota. How the financial panic of 1857 and the ensuing recession probably hit the Wakefields hard. How in 1861, after the inauguration of President Lincoln, John, who was a Republican, accepted a plum political appointment to be physician to the Upper Sioux, hoping, I think, to recoup his financial losses by working within the notoriously corrupt Indian system. I stoop down and pick up a chunk of brick from the rubble pile. Feels a little like grave robbing, but I'm going to take this home with me to South Dakota and hold on to it just until my work is done. Story 3. It's a gray November day just after Thanksgiving, and in Peever, South Dakota, I am sitting at the kitchen table of Darlene Renville Pipeboy, a Saskatchewan Dakota elder. Darlene is the great-granddaughter of Tiwankah, Gabriel Renville. In 1862, he was one of the leaders of the Peace Party, a faction of Dakotas that refused to fight the Americans. At great risk to themselves, they separated from their warring relatives and established a camp in opposition. They argued time and again in tribal councils against the hostilities. They demanded the unconditional release of hundreds of white and mixed heritage captives. They negotiated in secret with Henry Sibley, the American commander, trying desperately to end the bloodshed. Sometimes when I visit Darlene, I bring her tobacco for her prayers, or stones and firewood for the family Inipi, the sweat lodge. Darlene instructs me on Dakota lifeways, culture, spirituality, language. I am not a good Dakota speaker. My ear is fat and my tongue is thick, as they say, but Darlene is patient with me because that's the Dakota way. On this day, Darlene surprises me by arranging on the table between us 3 eagle feathers. One for me, one for my husband, and one for our teenage son. What she says next, I will not repeat. Her words will live in the circle of our family, but when she finishes speaking, she places the eagle feathers on a bed of dried sage and cedar leaves in a wooden box. Notice the German on the wooden box. She slides the box lid shut and sets the box in my hands. Suddenly I'm aware that I've been writing Darlene Pipeboy into the pages of my novel. I'm not talking just about her linguistic and cultural knowledge or her personal wisdom or her sense of humor, all of which has been seeping into my fiction. No, it's more than that. Darlene is the face I see. She's the voice I hear. She's the strength and the tenderness I feel as I'm creating the character Uchishi. Uchishi is my fictional name for the mother of Chaske, an actual Dakota man who is the main Indian lead in my novel. Uchishi is a kinship term. It means something like my mother-in-law, and in my novel, this is the name by which Chaske's mother asks Sarah to call her. I don't know what the actual name of Chaske's mother was. I don't know very much about that old woman at all. She seems to have been the daughter of Huiapa, Eaglehead, a Medewakantawa Dakota chief who was quite elderly at the time of the war. She was likely a widow in 1862, and to my knowledge, she only had 2 grown children, one being Chaske, as I mentioned, and the other being Winuna, his half-sister. Winuna and her husband, Hepa, had 2 young children, both boys, in 1862. Now, on the very first day of the war, unaware that fighting had broken out, Sarah and her 2 children were traveling in a wagon down the main reservation road toward Fort Ridgely. And the wagon was being driven by a clerk, an Irishman named George Gleason. They were coming up around supper time to an inn called the Halfway House, and they were going to stop and get a bite to eat before they continued on to the fort. But just before they got to the inn, 2 Indians emerged from the prairie grass and ambushed their wagons. These Indians were Chaske and his brother-in-law, Hepa. They killed George Gleason outright. Hepa wanted also to kill the Wakefields. But Chaske recognized Sarah from years before and thought she had a good heart. He argued for her life and the lives of her children, and he won that argument after some hours. Thereafter, he was responsible for their welfare. That's the way it worked, okay? So then his mother and his other family members were responsible for keeping the Wakefields safe and tending to their needs. Sarah grew to love Chaske's mother so much, that after the war, she said, I looked upon her as a mother. I looked upon her as a mother. You can imagine, with all the anti-Indian feeling in the aftermath of this war, what a remarkable admission that was for Sarah to make. Now, we don't know that much about Chaske's mother, but we have some information about Chaske himself. He belonged to the band of Shakpe, a Medewakantawa Dakota chief after whom the town of Shakopee, Minnesota was named. Okay? Now, according to Sarah, she first met Chaske back before she and John had moved to the reservation. In fact, the reservation didn't even exist yet. Okay, so their acquaintance went back a long time. How they met, how well they knew each other at that time is impossible for us to say. Unfortunately, I can find no picture of Chaske. I don't know what he looked like, okay? Now, once he got moved to the reservation, Chaske apparently assimilated, or he tried to, or he pretended to. He learned some English, he wore white-style clothing, he settled in a house with his wife and did some farming. Occasionally, he went to church. Above all, he cut his hair, signaling his willingness to adopt white ways. Now, this might have been a survival tactic, because he would have known that as a cut hair or farmer Indian, he would receive more food and supplies from the U.S. government than if he remained a traditionalist or a blanket Indian. Hi, welcome.
Thank you.
So, it's hard to say what was in his heart, Okay. Now, Chaske is a birth order name. Let me mention this. He got that preferential treatment because he was a cut hair, but that did not prevent the deaths of his wife and child, probably during the harsh winter that preceded the war. Okay. So Chaske is a birth order name. It means firstborn son. But this man also had a spiritual name, Wichompi Washte Dompi, which means something like he who is liked by the stars. How I would love to know the actual story behind that name, but I don't. I had to make something up based on what I knew of Dakota culture and what was going on. In the novel, his mother, Uchishi, is the one who carries the story of how he got his name. In fact, she is a carrier of all the old Dakota ways, despite the tremendous pressure that she has been under to abandon them. During the war, she treated the Wakefields as Dakota tradition demanded that captives be treated. She fed them, she clothed them, she sheltered them, she helped them navigate the culture, she integrated them as fully as possible into the family's life. Not all white captives were as fortunate as the Wakefields in this regard. Okay. What Chaske's mother did for Sarah Wakefield in captivity, Darlene Pipe Boy has done for me in friendship. She has welcomed me in. She has trusted me, even though there was no reason for her to. And she has given me more than I could ever hope to repay. The wooden box in my hands is so light that it might be empty. Yet this gift has substantial weight. Once again, I feel a responsibility to the dead to tell this story as best I can and to wrestle some good from it. But more than that, I feel a responsibility to the living who walk on sacred ground. Now, if I had time, I would tell you stories about Taoyate Duta, the reluctant war chief better known as Little Crow. Did you know, for instance, that he had ordered his soldiers not to attack civilians? If I had time, I would tell you stories about the missionaries who had labored for decades among the Dakota people and barely escaped with their lives when the fighting broke out. There are so many stories I could tell you and so little time, but I must end with the story of the land. Because the story of the land beneath our feet is behind all of this. The Dakota people rose up in 1862 not simply because they were hungry, not just because the U.S. government had once again failed to fulfill its treaty obligations, and not just because virtually every aspect of their tribal identity was under assault. No, they also rose up because settlers were encroaching on the tiny strip of homeland they had left, staking claims within the reservation boundaries, transforming hunting grounds into fields, reducing the already scarce game, and putting the very survival of the people at risk. No matter our heritage, I trust we can all agree, we have a sacred responsibility to our ancestors and to our descendants to walk upon this land in a good way, to walk upon this land with a good heart. When we do, the land speaks for itself. It tells its own story. And we, being good relatives, sit down together beneath the same stars to listen.